everyone, and welcome to First on Fraud, the podcast where we shine the spotlight on the dark side of real estate, exposing the fraudsters and all their wild schemes. Each month, we dive into the scams, the stories, and share tips on how you can protect yourself and your deal. From fake listings to forged documents and everything in between, we've got you covered like a First American title policy. And everyone, this is Matt Sager, the Senior Operations Counsel for First American Title Direct Division, otherwise known as my go-to, and someone that works very closely in cooperation with law enforcement whenever we have anything that comes up related to fraud.
And you are Sarah Frano, the Director of Underwriting Fraud Risks, or what we all like to call and what you have become known as the Fraud Queen.
Ah, thank you. Yeah, that's me. That's me, the Fraud Queen. Join me along with other First American subject matter experts discussing the growing threat of AI-driven fraud in real estate. We are going to share how to help stay ahead. Please register for the April 16th webinar entitled Unreal Deals, AI Deepfakes, and Real Estate Fraud. So I love all things fraud. And with that, I love to tell stories. And I'm going to tell you a story right now, Matt.
I'm glued. Everybody loves a good story.
Cliffhanger. So, guy goes to prison.
What did he do?
I'm so glad you asked me that question, Matt, because he went to prison for attempted axe murdering. So attempted murder, but it was with an axe. I feel like that's really important detail. He goes to prison, and before he goes in, he records a power of attorney for his property, giving one of his friends the right to handle his property. And so everyone listening out there, Matt, you're the lawyer.
Yes. Well, powers of attorney tend to be general, meaning that unless the power of the within the actual document itself, unless it specifies a limitation, if it's silent, that means it's general, meaning that they can act generally and do everything on behalf of the principal. I'm willing to bet, I'm sure it was a general power of attorney that was used in this instance.
You know, she could encumber the property, she could sell the property.
And it was a legit power of attorney. There was no questions as to whether or not that power of attorney was validly exercised and executed by the attempted axe murderer.
Yeah, it was legit. He was in prison.
Okay.
But the thing was, things between them while he was in prison went south. I guess he didn't like what was happening. And so he revoked the power of attorney while he was in prison. He wrote her a letter revoking it. And in this state, that's enough to revoke the power of attorney.
So it's of record saying you're authorized, but he revoked it.
He revoked it, and he didn't record the revocation.
So she lost her authority to act on his behalf.
But fast forward a couple years later, he gets out of prison and he goes back to his house. And he opens the front door to his house and he walks in, and there
he finds a new family.
A family. Yes. There is. How did you know? I know I haven't told you this story.
No, I figured that's where this had to be. I'm sure they weren't the Welcome Home from Prison committee.
No, they were not. And even better yet, like all of his furniture was gone. So new family is living there. It's not like this was a furnished rental and these people were renters. No, these people had purchased the home from a seller with a power of attorney, and she had acted on this power of attorney, and it was not verified with the principal that it had been revoked.
Rule number one with dealing with the power of attorney: you talk to the principal.
Right.
No matter where they are. If they're in prison, you got to find some way to talk to them.
And that's what happened here, is nobody talked to the principal. He was in prison. She took the money and she absconded with it, never to be seen again. And so, the story is very interesting, but what we need to talk about is the prison population. People really don't think of the prison population as being one that is targeted by fraudsters, but frequently they are because they are always having to rely on the outside person to help manage their affairs while they are in prison. So they're relying on other people who can take advantage of them.
Well, because there is a literal wall between the real estate professionals and the person we need to be working with, aka the prisoner. They're literal wall. So it makes working with them a little bit difficult. So it makes it easier for them to be taken advantage of.
Right. And I've seen it so many times over the years where fraudsters, and it's usually that somebody knows the fraudster, like this one, a power of attorney, a friend, a family member, but somebody is
Family
thinking,
member.
yeah.
Family, rule number 1, don't trust family. Rule number 2, don't trust someone who went to prison for attempted axe murdering.
Well, I mean, he was on the up and up with this real
victim.
estate. He was the victim. So that's the thing. These prisoners are the ones who are the victims by the fraudsters because they're, a captive, victim who may not find out about the fraud for years.
Well, and I'm sure there's a sympathetic story too as to why it makes sense, why we can't get a hold of, the victim. The story being, oh, they're incarcerated, really can't reach them. I'm taking care and managing their assets for them. They need the money to help cover their family expenses. Like I'm sure there's a story every single time with this.
What would you do if you have real estate?
I have a hard time faulting someone for trying to find someone they trust to deal with their assets. And so that's the important question is who do you trust? I tend to think though, if I'm going to prison for a long time, I don't know if I trust a particular person. I don't trust my brother.
That sounds like a family issue.
Vince, where
we don't have enough time to get into that on this podcast. But what if it was just a short time? What if you were just going in for a couple months?
I would do a lock and leave, and then I would just make sure that all payments for any of my taxes and my mortgage, my insurance, I would just make sure that that's all set up. I would make sure that's arranged so that nothing falls apart. And then absolutely, I would lock it and leave it. I wouldn't turn it over to Airbnb or VRBO.
Right. So, here's the thing, we don't really typically think of the prison populations as being vulnerable to fraud, but they are. And that's because they're doing exactly what you're going through in your head, which is like they have to rely on people on the outside to manage their affairs and their property with the highest integrity. And not everyone they know is going to have that same integrity or best interest or really look out for them. And so they become, sitting ducks. And while there's professional, property management services out there, you can use a power of attorney, you can appoint a friend, a trusted family member, or you can just, lock it and leave it, hiring a lawn service and just let it go. But it is, a segment of the population that we have to protect. And we just typically don't think of it as being, fraud targets, but they are. Let's not forget about the other victims in this scheme, which are the unsuspecting home buyers, right? So hopefully they've purchased a title policy. And in this case, in this example I'm giving, they did. And that's why I know about it, because they did and they were covered. So, if you didn't have a title policy, though, can you imagine you would lose probably your down payment that you paid for the property, your purchase money, if you paid cash for the property, any of that money that you put down to buy the property, and then any money you spent for improvements, moving expenses. And then these things often end up in court with the real owner coming back and, trying to quiet title to the property. And so then you've got legal fees and expenses, and those are never cheap. So there's just so many different types of fraud out there, and title insurance really is the absolute cheapest thing you can do to protect that type of an investment that you're making. And obviously I'm a huge proponent of title insurance, but I see the benefit every single day in these fraud claims from these innocent buyers who are out there, who are purchasing these properties from, people who are impersonating the owner. And this is so important for people to make that very small investment when they're purchasing properties. And this is exactly why. So we had this kind of scenario come up where we actually knew that the owner was in prison. that wasn't hidden, and that wasn't like a hidden fact. We were presented with a power of attorney. Hey, he's in prison. He was in prison in a foreign country. And with power of his attorney, what do we say, Matt?
When you have a power of attorney, you need to check with the principal. Don't
Exactly.
trust a power of attorney. But how do you do that when they're in a foreign prison?
This was not a prison where we could get in contact. We were able to get a picture of the person, like literally behind bars, like this, like deplorable conditions. There's no prisoner rights in this country. There was no ability to talk to this person, but we had the picture. Yes, they're in prison. We could verify that, but we weren't able to get in touch with the person to actually verify the POA. We just had to rely on the POA and go from there. And as it turns out, he did have a property manager as well. There were tenants in the property. The friend using the power of attorney, it was totally fake, totally fabricated.
The power of attorney was fake.
Totally fake, totally forged, everything.
I always find it interesting that when it comes to a real estate transaction, we do everything we can to try and identify and verify the person who's signing, that they are who they are. We get their ID, or we have this great remote online notarization. Yet when it comes to a power of attorney, we just take a piece of paper. We're relying on a piece of paper saying, I am authorized.
Anytime we can't speak to the principal, it's a huge red flag. And this gave a really logical reason. This was a plausible, believable, true. We would not be able to speak to that person in prison timely. We probably could if we filed some sort of motions or something like that with the court. Those type of things take a long time. And, I need the money for my legal fees. It all was a really good reason for selling the property.
I've seen prison transactions where a family member or someone is coming in and saying, oh, we have to sell the property in order to pay the legal fees,
right,
or to take care of this person's children or their family members. There is a plausible story that makes sense.
Right. So while we typically may not know that a person is in prison unless it appears of record and gives us some sort of indication, if we do have an owner that is in prison, we have to treat that sale or that refinance with extra care.
What would you do in this situation where they're in prison in a foreign country?
You have to verify it, and you verify it by actually contacting the principal directly. And if they tell you they can't appear, well, that's not enough. That's not good enough. You actually have to make direct contact with the principal or through, their agent or something like that. And by agent, I mean a actual retained attorney to represent them that is acting as their agent in that capacity. But we actually have to verify it with the principal, call them, make contact. We can't just let it ride.
Any power of attorney, you should immediately suspect. You should
Right.
question it. Always. But then if you find out if they are in prison, if they're a vulnerable population.
Mm-hmm.
And so now I think it's very
even it's
proper
a heightened, sense there, right? So shall we consider this case closed and lock up this episode?
You know what? Case closed. On to the next.
I like it. Until next time, everyone, stay informed and stay vigilant. Thank you. This episode is copyright 2025 by First American Financial Corporation, all rights reserved.